Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of AoS Shorts for In Your Phase and yours truly, Jeremy Visser. Today we're going to talk about Kharadron Overlord, an army. I think that from changes from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0 have been consistently drastic from edition to edition. And I am also today rocking my Team America jersey because this episode will be launching the day before we are all arriving in Milan to represent America for the AoS Worlds. And I hope you guys can check out our performance and keep an eye on and see all the announcements on Twitter and so forth and help support us. But outside of that, let's talk about Kharadron Overlord today. The Kharadron Overlords, and like I said previously, changed a lot from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. 1.0, they were considered like one of these kind of gimmicky armies because of a combination of stacking special weapons on Thunderers or Skyhooks on what's the name on Arcanauts. And there was also like the fact that like the boats were kind of irrelevant and useless most of the time. So like one of the signature models of the army was completely useless. It just degraded too much and shooting wasn't really that useful. So in 2.0 they decided, you know what, like this is a signature unit. Let's just make it actually decent. And they did. They made boats fairly decent. Problem was that they didn't want it to be too powerful. So in the context of so they really took a really big nerf bat on how boats and units inside the boats interacted. Now the boats themselves, very good, very powerful, lots of shooting, lots of mobility, pretty durable, especially in 2.0. But then they said, you know what, that's too powerful if you include the units inside. We didn't want them, they didn't want Kharadron Overlord from 1.0 to 2.0 to basically participate in objective effectively. So units inside the boats do not score, do not contest objectives. Is what I should say, because they do score, they just don't contest objectives. And then on top of that, they also have a bunch of rules that the units have while they don't get the benefit of it while inside the boats. So basically they're like, we'll make the boats good, but then we'll make the synergy of units in the boats not so good. So once again, an army that's just kind of weirdly will functionally change how it plays, and then we'll just also not really quite figure out like the dynamism of that book. Finally, the changes in 3.0. So let's talk. Army has not changed at all from 2.0, from 3.0, except for the fact that it got worse in every regard. And what I mean by that is that the disembark rules change for boats. Basically all garrisons change for disembark rules. The way it used to work was that if the boat basically did not move, the unit inside could disembark at the start of the movement phase, and then the boat could still move. Now they changed the disembarkation rule as to be at the end of the movement phase, and thus also if there's an additional layer of restriction if the unit inside the boat cannot disembark if the boat has moved at all. So from a context of timing, it means that if you want to disembark your boat, you can't move your boat. And for an army that defends around movement, that's pretty crippling. So in that sense, that was a pretty big change and nerf to the book. Also, they changed how Ether Gold works. So for context, for people who don't know how to play against Kharadron Overlords have this thing called an Ether Gold. And Ether Golds are basically kind of like Ether Quartz for Lumineth, if you're aware of what that is. But for KO units, it's basically the ability to use a Triumph, or basically or a very specific, unique set of abilities that were released during the Kragnos book to unlock some once per phase, like effectively bonus. It used to be that the gold used to give, one of the triumphs used to be reroll saves, and that was very powerful because it made ironclads incredibly tanky. And one of the changes they did from 3.0 to 2.0 is they got rid of that reroll save mechanic. And as well as the fact that it only gave us for mechanically triumph +1 to wound, which is well powerful, but it kind of forces the army in this weird situation where it's less defensive and more offensive, which is kind of what KO was already. It was an offensive army with some slight gimmickal defensive mechanism, so it can at least participate on the objectives. Sorry, you just saw my ghostly Sharpay in the background. And sorry, I didn't track lots of time there. But anyway, the changes are they decided the triumphs are now more offensive and less defensive, right? So in a sense, Kharadron Overlord got less defensive but more offensive. So you could say it's a wash. but really it's not, because they were already offensive enough that like the extra defense, like really what made them decent at competing for objectives was the defensive element. Now, one of the major changes in 2.0 to 3.0 was the fact that they gained Unleash Hell, and the fact that what's it called? The all-out attack is not +1 to hit. So all these command abilities for KO actually was, once again, you'll see a notice here, more offensive. The +1 to hit is incredibly good because the Admiral has a command ability that gives a boat rerolls once they hit. And in one of the situation was in 2.0, since all that attack did the same thing, it's like, why would you ever use the Admiral for anything? Well, now you have kind of redundancy plan where you can give a boat reroll once and the guys inside can get +1 hit, or another boat can get +1 hit. So there's like this kind of double whammy mechanical way of like doubling down on offensive, which is a pattern you'll see here. I'm repeating a lot. KO got more offensive. And Unleash Hell, once again, is, it's actually very powerful, but it actually surprisingly is hard to use in KO armies. And here's why. The only units that can give command abilities in KO are heroes and unit leaders. So if you're a unit leader, and the unit leader can only give it to his own unit. So if you have a frigate, let's say, that's by himself with the unit inside, the frigate cannot benefit from any command ability. It cannot give itself command ability. It cannot receive itself command abilities. And I'm going to even explain why more in 3.0. So yeah, like keep in mind, like if you're afraid of Unleash Hell, if you're afraid of Disengage, which is also a huge bonus for KO, you just got to pay attention where the heroes are. That's really what it comes down to. And because, while it is a big aura from the general, the army does play a lot very fractured, typically not very often castled up, and it's for a very specific, kind of deny flank strategy. So you don't have to be too afraid of anything that's not in the ironclad, because it's actually surprisingly hard to fit things in frigates with heroes, unless you take 5 Thunderers and like 1 hero, or up to 5 more heroes. And at that point, you're like, is that really something you gotta be afraid of? Probably not really. The only time you'll probably see is you gotta worry about command range and some of these abilities is when if you see an Endrin Master in a dirigible suit, which the guy in the hero in the balloon, then you're gonna have to worry a little bit more about that for war range. But for the most part, command abilities for KO, just more shooty. Now, if somebody uses Redeploy, which was mentioned earlier, you kind of, as a KO player, you actually like almost never want to. It's very rare that you're going to use it, because if you use Redeploy, you use the ability to Unleash Hell. So, it's going to have to be a kicker. Like, it's going to have to be in situations where you're like, well, I want to Unleash Hell this thing, but the thing that I actually redeploy is this other thing, so I can get in range of the, if he charges, so I can get in range for Unleash Hell in case of you're out of position. Like, those are all things. Like, the redeploy for a KO is basically, ah, shit, I fucked up my movement. I need to readjust it so I can basically get back in the range of Unleash Hell or so forth, right? It doesn't matter. The other fact is that, once again, as I mentioned earlier, like the Admiral got more value because now his command ability reroll 1 stacks on boats. He has a native +1 to hit for everything inside a boat in combat, which is great for 1 command ability. He's good at killing monsters in combat, which is another reason why he's valuable, because monsters are like, he's one of the few things in the book that has Ren 2 in melee, so or even Ren 2 in general outside of sky cannons and drill cannons. So it's kind of like he's pretty good. Like he's just all around a good character, and he provides an immunity to battle shock aura. So like I think you'll see a lot more admirals taking KO books just because of all the benefits he provides now, and he doesn't seem kind of a lackluster choice versus 2.0. The other big change is and they kind of, I'm recording this after the new set of facts just came out. They kind of doubled down on trying to say that you can sky high while in combat, but it actually wasn't very clear from 2.0 to 3.0 if you could. In the sense that in 2.0, if you retreated, it was still considered a normal move in a sense. So the disengage and sky high rule was kind of like, it worked in kind of like this, symbiotic relationship. In 3.0, when you declare a retreat move, it is no longer a normal move. And Sky High only lets you Sky High if you have done a normal move. And it says in parentheses, if you disengage, you can. So it was kind of like up in the air, like, well, we really actually need a kind of an update on that rule for it to just work in 3.0 very clearly. But, you could argue it's like, well, yeah, I could see both, like, why would it not? And then they basically, doubled down and said, well, not double down, but they basically kind of said, yeah, you could definitely Sky High if you disengage. combat. So it's not quite rewriting, but it's good enough to say, sure, that works. One of the also big, lackluster things about KO is that it has no monsters. None of the boats are monsters, guys. They're not even war machines. Or sorry, some of them are war machines. They're not artillery. So the big thing here is that like they can't be taking in the artillery specific battalion. They can be taken in Alpha Beastback or one in battle regiment. So it's actually really hard to build a KO list to be both low drop and also have boats. The regular gun haulers do fit as regular units, but because they're not behemoths, but the frigates and ironclad are behemoths, just not monsters. So in a weird cases, like the list I took recently was 3-drop because I had both frigates inside of Alpha Beastback and the ironclad inside the battle regiment. That's like pretty much, unless you're going to do only one ironclad, that's the lowest you can go drop count wise. Well, actually, yeah, it is. You can go down to 2 drops if you only take one frigate, but then you're not taking the battalion either. And talking about Alpha Beastback, one of the things they actually clarified in the fact this week, what I was going to talk about in the show, is that you can definitely sky high with the Alpha Beastback. I played it very conservatively for my last event, where I just assume you can, and rarely does it actually come into play that often. I think it comes into play for people who want to force your opponent into basically, like, if you're in a situation where you're, as a KO player, you never want to go first, because you don't want to get double turned, and almost all the time you get penalized for trying to alpha strike. Like, very rarely does an alpha strike for me work out to my advantage over getting double turned. And so in a situation, like, if you can use the Alpha Beastback Sky High combo, it's to not really necessarily push for the alpha strike. It's just really to just make your opponent, have to go first. Because in case they fear, like, the alpha strike by making you go first, if you put them in a position where, like, shit, I don't want to go second, because if I let you go first, you're going to alpha me to death and bring all the guns to bear very quickly. Or if you just, think you're safe enough where they can't really kill the boat or can't get the good charge on the boat, and you're just basically in a good position, like, yeah, then it's powerful. But I don't recommend using it as, like, that's the design list, so I can alpha strike my opponent every time. It's not a good design list. Often, most of the time, it will hurt you more than anything. Other things you got to watch out for in 3.0 for KO. You have to watch out for Last Word, which is an Endrin works. It's basically a mount trait for the boats, and only the ironclad can take it. It just lets them shoot the main cannon it has, so it's either the Great Volley Cannon or the Great Sky Cannon or the Great Skyhook. And this just lets it shoot at a unit that finished a charge within 3 inches of it at the end of the charge phase. So it's kind of like a double, like it's another Unleash Hell trigger in a sense. But unlike Unleash Hell, it can shoot at any unit that finished a charge within 3 inches of it. So it doesn't matter if, like, there's multiple units in combat with it. So in a way, you would argue, like, it's pretty actually terrifying charging an ironclad with both Unleash Hell and that, because you're like, and especially since that thing does not suffer the -1 penalty to shoot. So you're like, don't want to do that. Once again, another reason why Redeploy is kind of bad for KO, because not only do you lose that, and you also lose a mount trade. So got to keep in mind, like, of when you see Last Word on one of the ironclads, you're like, okay, that's what I got to be afraid of. It gets to shoot its main cannon effectively twice at a target that charged it. I personally still think the Deal Breaker Ram works more often than not, because I don't have to care too much about the redeploy as much. It's like one less mechanism I'm losing on, and, like, that's one of the best way to generate mortal wound in a book that has very little mortal wound generation. So it is very powerful. The Arcane Tome is actually pretty much the only way you could get monster scoring outside of allies or coalition units in KO. So if you wanted to turn here's kind of a weird thing, right? So if I have a character, like, let's say my ammo inside the boat, and I have an Arcane Tome, and I turn him into metamorphosis into a monster. Technically now he is a monster, so he could do Monstrous Rampage from inside the boat. Okay. I roar at thee from the half side of my ship, and then there is the fact that, like, while inside the boat, he still scores, but does not contain an objective. So, like, for example, Monsters Takeover doesn't really work for him, but if he does kill, like, a monster for bringing it down with that trigger, that does work. It's just very powerful to try to deny other units the ability to use command abilities, because let's just be honest, KO melee is not that powerful, but you can make it somewhat decent with like Endrin Masters inside the boat with the Admiral. You're just like, you really don't want to fight things with like stacking saves if you can avoid it. There's, so there's ways to get points for monsters, but it requires you taking the Arcane Tome. And rarely I think you'll see KO players take it. I'm trying to think if there is any kind of like sub-allegiance changes. I honestly, sub-allegiance from 2.0 to 3.0 have not really changed for KO in terms of mechanical ways. You could argue that Barak Urbaz got worse because Ether Gold got worse in a sense, right? It's not as defensive. You don't get the reroll saves anymore. All you get is a +1 hit, a +1 wound mechanic, or the reroll charge, or whatever. It is nice to get an extra gold on the Ether Chemist and the Ether Navigator, because they have a special ability when they spend their Ether Gold. Like the Ether Chemist can give reroll 1 to wound to a boat inside the boat, or a unit inside the boat, without actually being out of the boat. Once again, another limitation: if you start in the boat, you can't use these abilities unless you spend another gold. The Ether Navigator also has a pretty decent one, where one is just reroll Unbind or Dispel rolls for an Ether Gold, which can come in kind of clutch sometimes. And also, finally, he can add an extra D6-inch movement to a boat. And that can come into play because the Ironclad is not that fast. So it's not a situation that the extra D6 movement can make the difference between making that a charge or getting in range with the 12-inch guns, especially if you're already downgraded low enough where you can't get this sky high anymore. So there's just lots of ways to make it important. If boats were monsters, like, you would see a lot more like KO players like, oh, this is just absolutely phenomenal. Like, I can get super easy secondaries. I can also make my boats a top bracket, in a phase, which means in the movement phase they can always disengage if they're basically like crippled. Like, there's just so many. Like, if they're a good thing, they're not monsters, right? Is what it comes down to. But in terms of like sub-allegiance mechanic, Barak Zelfing is still probably going to be taken a lot. I think there's some play with Barak Trang. There's some, actually, honestly, there's play with all the sub-allegiances in 3.0 right now. I played with a homebrew Skyport for Old Town Throwdown, so it's not like Barak Zelfin is like for sure guaranteed, and that comes down to the fact that tables are smaller, so you don't really need the hero move as much to drop the Warp Lightning Vortex in the best place possible. And with also the changes to Ether Vortex gets dropped now between it, because it can't be within 1 inch of enemy models, it can't be within 1 inch of terrain. Like, you're not necessarily looking to alpha strike something with it. It's just a nice like second to third turn. Like, okay, like I can just control, like, try to dictate the flow of the battle from that point forward. Anyway, I talked a lot about KO. I'm going to talk a lot more about KO this weekend. Also, based on this release date, the previous weekend, you can check out the Ethercast. I'm a guest host there this week talking about Kharadron Overlords, especially how I did at Old Town Throwdown. The book is fine. It did take a lot of nerf from 3.0 in many ways, but it still performs, right? We saw a couple of major events, basically go 5-0. It's still a very powerful book because it's much like Giants. It is very much a gatekeeper list. Like, I think it was my last opponent at Old Town Throwdown who tried to describe it that he can build a list to beat Giants, but he can't build a list to beat Giants and KO. Right? It's kind of like this weird thing where the meta is so stratified in the way it works and how things function that like KO has a place. It's just it's hard for me to picture KO as a 5-0 army consistently, because it does not play very well to missions. In terms of primary, holding objectives is very hard. I guess I should mention, boats did double for board control. They do count as 2 models instead of 1 now. So there's that. But it was just it's just not an army that it's everything you're doing is res or edge. Like, you have to you can't overcommit. You can't really put Hail Mary plays. You rarely get rewarded for it. It's just a very razor edge army to play. And with that, it was me, Jeremy, talking about Kharadron Overlord for In Your Face Media, and I hope you all have a lovely week. And please watch and support us for Team America as we do participate in AoS Worlds. All right, folks.